Gun violence. Is it a gun problem? Is it a people problem? Or is it both? Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. David with another episode of Your Health, Your Choice. This is the second part of a three-part series on gun violence in America, where we are trying to look at different angles, trying to take it as objective of a view as possible, trying to be open-minded as well as solution-oriented. Joining us, of course, is Shari Kulanu, who is our executive producer, as well as my sister. Hi, Shari.
Hi, David. So great to be here.
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, to talk about these very painful and difficult topics. In our first episode, we kind of laid some groundwork. We talked about some statistics to really set this up. Today, we are really talking, as I mentioned, about the guns and the people who use them, as well as advertising and other marketing, legislation, many other topics. But our episode three is going to be about looking for practical potential solutions that may help decrease gun deaths in our country. So, Shari, and I know we've talked a little bit about why we're covering this because of the fact that this is both a medical issue in that we are dealing with death, we are dealing with suicide, we are dealing with mental health impacts. But of course, the fact that it's also a choice issue because the choices that we make in terms of how we act, what types of laws we put together in society, so kind of really right into our your health, your choice wheelhouse, if you will. But let's talk first. So, Shari, is this a people problem?
Okay, so as you and I have discussed for now hours and hours, we're trying to make some sense out of this, right? Like we're trying to look at which part of this is really about people and things that can be addressed related to people, related to society and how we function, and what's related to the guns itself in terms of them as a vehicle or an instrument. So we're going to first talk about some general correlations. And, one of the things that we want to point out is that, guns are not just weapons that lead to fatality, they also lead to incredible injury. They can also be used as a weapon of threat and psychological torture. And that leads us kind of right into our first topic. So there's a definite correlation. Regardless of who has studied this over time, there is a very strong evidence that there is a correlation between people who have a history of violence and people who are abusers and people who commit crimes with weapons and specifically firearms. So, in a domestic violence situation, if there is a gun involved, the chances that there will be broader fatalities in terms of collateral damage is very high. But not only that, the likelihood that an abuser will kill their victim is much higher if a gun is involved. And certainly, them using the threat of death through a gun or firearm is increases the emotional influence and the emotional abuse and the power dynamic that comes into play. Now, there's also a very strong link, and this is something that I've worked on in my career, between animal abuse and violent tendencies towards human or having violent ideations or doing those kinds of things. In fact, people who have committed violent crimes towards, or just violence in general, towards animals are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against humans. And we saw this in Uvalde, right? In the recent shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, it is now known that the perpetrator of that act of terrorism is somebody who had previously abused animals. So that's just one of many, many examples. Um, so, David, I want you to talk a little bit, though, about the mental health aspect of this, right? This is a little more complicated than I think a lot of people, obviously one could argue that if you are using a weapon that there is to kill people or injure people, that there is a strong possibility that you do have some type of mental health thing going on. But you have also talked about that that's not always the case, right?
Right.
So, talk a little bit about mental health as it relates to people in gun violence.
Yeah. So, first of all, mental health, from the research that we looked up, is not a predictor in and of itself of violent acts towards others. Okay. It is a predictor of suicide. Of course, we know the very big correlation between things like depression, bipolar disorder, and suicide, which, as we talked about, is actually more of a killer by guns than any mass murderers or other types of homicides. So there is that correlation going in the direction. But just because a person has a mental health issue does not mean that they are more likely to commit a heinous crime like this. And in fact, this has been an issue because even some of the mental health agencies and advocacy groups have kind of felt like this is almost kind of like putting blame on people who have mental health issues who already have stuff going on, right? And so is this one more thing that we want to put on when they're hearing on the news, oh, this is a mental health issue? Well, no, that's not what the data is showing, and we shouldn't be putting that stigmatism on people because again, they have enough already. Um, but the the previous violence of itself, okay, that really seems to be the previous violence does seem to be a predictor, though, of future violence. Okay, so if there was, whether, and that's true, obviously, whether a person had a mental health issue or not. But of course, it's not just mental health because not everybody who goes on to commit these crimes have those issues. There are people, such as the person who did the killing in Buffalo, where they were indoctrinated into a racist replacement theory, which we'll talk a little about too. So again, it's not always mental health that leads to these types of things. Okay, but it's also important, as I mentioned, previously, more than half of all gun deaths in our country are from suicide. So this is a mental health issue from that perspective, and because obviously, if people who are suicidal have their hands on a gun, they're more likely to do it. So, one of the things as a pediatrician that I do, especially with any pre-adolescent to adolescent, we kick the parents out of the room. And we, amongst the many other things we talk about, in terms of, you know, alcohol and substance abuse and safe sex, we also talk about. I always bring up questions. Have there ever been times where you've thought about hurting yourself? But and just because they've thought about it, that does not make a person suicidal. The next important question is, have you ever had a plan? And what would that plan be? Because if a person has a plan, I know where the gun is. I know where my parents keeps it. I know where the Tylenol bottle is. I know where the knives are. The person who has the plan is actually the one that's most likely to go through and to move forward and have these kind of acts. But it's not the act of questioning whether you have that problem. But I tell every one of my patients, my conversation with you is completely confidential unless you share with me that you're going to try to hurt yourself or somebody else, because then I do have a moral as well as a legal responsibility to make sure that that does not happen, but to also get you the help and support that you need, because you're a wonderful person and you're a beautiful person, as we all are, and you deserve better. Okay, so that's a really important thing that as a pediatrician, something that I'm thinking about on a very daily basis. That is not usually part of the common communications relative to this topic. So, I'm glad I have an opportunity to make an impact from that, because I think that really can make a big difference. And I've had a few incidences where not to the level of that, but people tell me about them cutting themselves and other types of things, and we know that that could be a very big predictor for other violent episodes as well. Okay. Most people, though, who commit suicide are not bad guys. Okay, so that's again another thing, part of that stigmatism. But also, we should also talk about the role that poverty has. Um, and again, we know so much about children growing up in poverty and what that does to them, to all other aspects, to their future in life, to their ability to succeed in life, getting proper educated. But also, there's research that shows that countries with greater poverty level, counties in America, pardon me, counties in America that have greater poverty levels saw the largest increase in firearm homicides. And again, all of these statistics, we do put the links down in the comments, in the notes below. So please look there if you want to see where we're getting this from. But in those communities, we're talking about people who are more desperate, that more hopeless. They view things as being unfair. But also, let's face it, if a person can't get their basic needs met, their basic necessities, are they more likely to commit a crime? Right? Are they more likely to go into a store? Not necessarily that they're even armed, but if a person breaks into an arm into a store, then the likelihood of them being shot by a person who works there, a security guard, of course, that also goes up as well, and those contribute to gun deaths as well. Um, Now, Shari, I know that there's other aspects in terms of things like white supremacy, racism, and extremism that we've clearly seen be a contributor here as well. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I want to talk about, and we'll talk about this more in the next episode as it relates to racism, is there are studies that have shown that that Black people in specific are more likely to be killed by firearm from law enforcement or from civilians in general. That there is sort of an underlying bias that's there. So there is ways in which systemic racism comes into play in terms of gun violence. There is also this aspect of white supremacy and extremism, which is not necessarily subconscious in the same kind of way. So, hate crimes are prevalent in this society. Hate crimes that involve a gun in our country, there's an average of 28 of them a day involving a firearm specifically. But one of the things that's interesting, and we'll talk more about this as we get to looking at social media and some of the other things, is that the way that extremism and racism is on the rise in our country, for sure, as we've seen, and as the studies show, is that there's sort of a younger generation that has come up in the age of the internet. And it is now possible to be exposed to extremism and to conspiracy theories and to hatred while you're sitting in your own room by yourself. You know, you can be indoctrinated, you can have peer pressure, there can be a dehumanization aspect of this. Back in the day before technology was what it was, where everybody has a computer in their home and their phone and everything like that, in order to be exposed to this, you were either going to be exposed to it by your family or somebody close to you in your community who had those beliefs. You were maybe going to go to an event where you were going to be exposed to these beliefs, but now you can just be by yourself and be exposed to these beliefs. So the opportunity to indoctrinate and to spread extremist conspiracy theories is much different than it was back in the day. So there's also something to be discussed in terms of white supremacy and extremism, which we're going to get to in a little bit. And this has to do with some of the rhetoric that we hear coming from sort of news hosts and leaders of organizations and political figures. So I want to look now at looking at marketing and PR and messaging. So David, talk to us about marketing and PR.
Yeah,
Again, we're
and
still talking about people. That's what we're not talking about the guns themselves. We're talking about people and how we interact with each other.
right, and by bringing these things up, this is not at all that we're implying that people who are gun owners are racist or are members
Right.
of extremist groups or anything whatsoever. Of course, we know that that's the farthest from the truth for the overwhelming majority of people. We're talking about that people who are being indoctrinated, who also have access to guns,
Right.
are more likely to fulfill these types of racist acts. So I did want to
Absolutely.
be clear that we're not putting blame on the guns for this type of thing, but the fact that you put those two things together. Um, but yes, but obviously, from a marketing and a PR perspective, now, um, the gun industry itself, gun lobbies, okay, the more advertise, and this again, is something that is sourced in our references below. Part of my hiccup. The more advertising and encouragement, the more likely someone is who shouldn't have a gun is going to get one. Okay, so again, people will try to get guns if they want one. We know that that's one of the issues and one of the things that we're going to talk about in our solutions part. But just the sheer aspect that the more that it's becoming more commonplace and marketed in such a way, that could be even part of the access of somebody saying, "Oh, I'm going to go and get one no matter how I can, whether it's legally or not." But we know that there are political influences on this. I mean, let's face it. If we're seeing leaders of our country or prospective leaders in so many commercials, this is me shooting a gun. Okay, that's a normalization. Kids see, hey, those are our leaders. They're out there shooting guns. They're shooting guns. And so again, what is that teaching people of showing just a normalization of that aspect? Okay,
Well, and I want to add
um,
something to that because this is something that you and I talked about in terms of the decades that you and I have been alive. The amount of guns that I see in political ads now compared to when we were younger, right? It's really obvious that there is some kind of a trend of like I can't get elected in my amongst my constituencies unless I make it very, very clear that I promote guns, that I'm a gun promote, whatever that looks like. And so, we constantly see these ads now of political figures shooting things, whatever they may be, in their ads, but also like pictures of them with their family, with their kids with guns, like all of these type of things that seem to be a fairly new phenomenon in the last couple of decades that we didn't see before in the same way.
Right, and it doesn't mean that those politicians who are doing that are teaching their kids irresponsibly
Right,
or
right.
acting irresponsibly themselves, right? This is more just about the normalization for the person who's on the fringe, for the person who may be more unstable, for the person who's not sure which direction that they're going to go. The more that they're seeing these types of things could potentially be an issue there. But is there even a targeting of people who are susceptible to extremism? Okay. Now, we had done some research on this, and even in terms of the targeting of youth, okay, we saw from an ad that was actually part of on the on the one of the NRA National Rifle Association's Family Insight that specifically showed it had the text. If your kid is looking for your first rifle, if pardon me, if you're a kid looking for your first rifle, this is the gun you need to tell your parents about. Right. So this is targeting the children. Right. This isn't talking to a parent who's saying, hey, listen, if you wish to purchase a gun for a smaller one for your child to train, you could consider this. Which, again, people can have their own thoughts about this, but they're targeting the children of telling the children this is the gun to go get me. Okay. That is very impressionable. Okay. And that to me is where I see a line being crossed. Okay. The manufacturer of the weapon that killed the 19 children, 2 adults in Uvalde, Texas, Daniel Defense, specifically the week before that mass shooting, that terrible incident, put up a social post featuring a toddler holding a similar gun to that which was used in that heinous act. Okay, and it also said the text: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Not putting that into any context of safety. Maybe if they would have said, it's important to be safe and teach your child properly if have gun storage and gun shooting, etc., and that can be help them be responsible gun owners when they're later. That's not what it said. All it said was train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I guess they're also singling out boys, not girls. I guess girls aren't involved in this since it's so obvious they're using the word he all over the place. But that's another topic as well. Um, but all of this is a level of desensitization that we have to ask: what impact is this having?
Sure. You know,
Yeah,
well, I was going to say, there is something else that we were talking about the gun industry and the gun lobby. And, I do want to say, too, when we were talking about politicians, that as is the case with any lobbying, this happens with cigarettes, this happens with automobiles, this happens with any type of industry when they want to get politicians elected that will support their industry and make it easier for them to sell merchandise. Politicians are funded largely by the gun lobby. Right. And what's interesting, and you pointed it out in the previous episode, is that the majority of the members of something like the NRA or various other gun lobbying organizations actually are in favor of having, some form of regulation, some form of safety devices, more training, more public education for safe gun ownership. Yet that does not seem to be what the lobby itself is promoting when it comes to legislation. So that is an area of marketing and PR. I want to talk a little bit, David, about social media as a particular platform for marketing and PR. So, compared to traditional outlets, I already mentioned this before, there's ability to access people in such a different way in terms of marketing. And studies have been shown about this, right? So, for example, there is very scientific algorithms that are used on social media, depending on if you've ever clicked on something before. A particular word that you might put in a post will trigger algorithms to then start marketing to you. And so there's a very highly sophisticated targeting marketing that's going on here that is contributing to people who are prone towards violence getting access to and being encouraged to purchase certain firearms. Um, there's also an opportunity through social media, as we mentioned before, for recruitment at a different type of level than we had for extremism and other types of things. And then there's also the issue of there being fettered instructional videos that are now available through social media, teaching you how to alter firearms to make them more dangerous, but also just various other things that are sort of making it cool and neat, especially for impressionable kids. That again, in the past, social media as a particular platform is one of those people problems, right? It's a way that we engage with other people. I want to move us kind of a little bit through some of these last couple things. This is obviously a longer episode because this is an important topics, but looking at entertainment, right? There are people who say, well, it's because we have violence in our movies, we have violence in our games, that this is why this is happening. Now, I will say that compared to other first world countries, compared to other countries of certain income and population size, like we talked about in the first episode, they have those same games, they have those same movies, and yet they somehow do not seem to have anywhere near the rate of violent crime by firearm that we do. However, those games and those movies and those, that type of things, that does have some form of a desensitization or a normalization aspect to them. If you are playing a game where you are using something that's shaped like a gun, and you're basically gunning down people as part of the game, those are actually games that were developed in part by the military to help train soldiers on how to kill people, right? And how to desensitize them to killing people. That's been shown. So, to say that entertainment is the cause of this would be, an incorrect thing to say. But to not include entertainment in the conversation would also be a problem.
Yeah, because it's all things. The more angles that something's coming at you, the more impact it's going to have. So, not necessarily that we're saying that each and one of these things solely is the problem, right? But what we're saying is that when it's all surrounding you, it builds up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about one more aspect of this. And again, one of the things that we really made a point when we were working on this show is distinguishing between people and the guns themselves, right? That's why we're calling it a gun problem or a people problem. So there is this one other aspect that we want to talk about in reference to the people problem, the society problem, and that has to do with rhetoric. So,
Yeah.
David, talk a little bit about that, please.
Certainly. And as people may know, I look at all types of news sources. I am not one who just listens to news on the left, on the right, the center, whatever. I really try to make sure that I am well rounded in getting information from all different sides. Okay. And so, obviously, in our world, it's almost like we're living in two worlds, because if you're not looking at those different angles, you may be living in a completely different world than the person next to you, even though you're living on the same planet, because of the information that you're receiving or being exposed to. And one of the things that I clearly heard talked about was such things as, like, there's a lack of, that this gun violence issue is because there's a lack of family values, about not having a father in the house, a lack of religion. Okay, now, first of all, I was able to find no research whatsoever that any of those things contribute to this problem. Okay, but it's certainly, we've seen this is promoted on some of the social medias and on the channels. But what is needed is, children need loving parents, loving caregivers, those are present for them, those are who are able to help them work through their problems, those to help them identify when there are issues and get them help. Not having those types of supports when the parents are, it's a challenge. There are some parents who have to work two jobs and they're never around, and so they have latchkey kids, etc. So again, not blaming the parent for that, but we know that the more that a parent is there to be supportive, the less likely that these kids are gonna not have solutions for themselves for when they get into when they have these thoughts, these issues, or whatever. Okay. Um, but it is interesting because I've also heard, because there's not enough, there's not a man in the house. Okay. Now, we talked before about how domestic violence, especially with guns, is very largely perpetuated by men. Okay, so if there is a man in the house who is exhibiting domestic violence, threats, etc., it's even possible that having those guys in the house could be making this more impressionable on the child, because we know that whether they're a victim or an observer of domestic violence, that they're more likely to be then take on gun violence. So maybe that's not even that's thing, And obviously, I'm not blaming this on the dads whatsoever. But I mean, again, if you're going to say this is because you don't have a dad issue, hey, could you say maybe it's because they're seeing the more likely to be the perpetuator of it? And again, I know that most dads are not people committing those types of heinous acts. But not only that, but even in terms of, when you talk about a lack of religion or even like lack of a parent, that can even be looked at by some people, especially in minority communities, as something that's attacking them. So is this potentially even looking that's unintentionally or intentionally of like trying to single out certain communities as maybe the perpetuators of this? Where again, that doesn't exist in terms of the information, but what does it do? It does flame the fires when people are hearing about this. It's a you versus not me problem, and just in further division in general. And obviously, we are all about trying to stop division in our society. We are all about, and even with this channel, how can we be bringing together people that may have completely different views, but where is the commonality of there? But also part of that is trying to not let society get further down that path. So, anyway, but we talked about again people problem versus gun problem. I realize, and again in listening to the different news sources, that there are some people out there who are saying this is not a gun problem; it's a people problem. Now, everyone does agree that there's a people problem here. Now, the gun problem is harder, and that does seem to be where the divide is. Now, discharging of a firearm, of course, it always involves a person who is firing that weapon. So it does involve a gun, right? It's there, someone is involved in it, but at the end of the day, if there was no trigger to be pulled, right, there can't be gun violence there. So anybody who is out there saying this is just this is not a gun problem, it's a people problem, I'm sorry, but I can't buy into this. I mean, it kind of, as you can see where we're going with it, this is a both problem,
Right.
right? But at the same time, that would be similar to saying um, that a killing from a drunk driving has nothing to do with alcohol. Okay, well, of course it does. Yeah, it was a person problem. Yeah, the person themselves is who drank and and who drove the car. But at the same time, it's an alcohol problem too, right? And
Right.
so that's kind of an important thing. But again, if the majority of the murders and as well as the majority of suicides are occurring via guns, it is a gun thing. And again, every single act of gun violence involves one commonality: the gun. Okay. So Shari, share a little bit more of your thoughts about this.
All right. Well, you and I were talking about this, and it's so hard to sort of tear apart, when we're talking about people, because we're also talking about the guns, we're talking about who could be influenced, we're talking about who uses them more, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the people, the psychological, the sociological aspects of it. But what we want to talk about just right now before we start to wrap up is the guns themselves, right? Guns are nothing more than an instrument or a vehicle for causing something to happen, right? They are a weapon. Um, the technology of a gun, we talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about the Second Amendment, but the technology of a gun affects who's going to be killed or how likely it is that they're going to be killed or how many people are going to be killed. It also affects how likely it is somebody may survive, right? And so, what we're talking about when we're talking about the guns as a vehicle or the guns as an instrument, just the actual physical object itself, technology has changed, right? There are such things as the frequency that bullets can be discharged, right? So you can look at such things as the size of the magazine, how many bullets are readily available to be just loaded into the weapon itself, that can be then triggered or fired. But you're also talking about such things as semi-automatic weapons, in which you have to pull the trigger each time, but the bullets are just readily available. There's no revolving aspect to this, right? There's no other step that needs to get taken. And then, of course, there's automatic weapons where you literally just hold the button down and it fires until the magazine is out. And a lot of people think that those are illegal. But we found evidence that shows that that is actually not the case, right? There are loopholes, there are ways around it, that automatic weapons are absolutely accessible to people that are going to want to get them or that are going to try to get them. So the frequency that bullets are fired, but also the speed that the bullet comes out of the weapon. Technology has improved, just like technology includes with cars or with computers or with anything else. Technology, design, engineering have improved how guns are able to have sensitivity of trigger so that the trigger itself has a quicker impact. And again, as we said, as far as the number of bullets that are readily available, it's also interesting to talk about here that, as is often the case with commercial civilian objects or commercialized products versus military products, a lot of the developments of technology that have occurred in guns have taken place through military R&D. And so there is a militarization of civilian weapons that has happened. So, because there's not a strong distinction between what is designed for combat and for warfare versus what is designed for protection and for civilian use, there's this blending that has kind of occurred. And that's driven a lot of the changes of the technology and the sophistication of the guns that are in our society compared to in the past. Um, so the last thing that we're going to talk about here, David, is the sheer number of guns, right? So we talked about guns as an entity, as an instrument, the technology, but there's also just the volume of guns, right? That doesn't have anything to do per se with people, although it does, because that's how the guns got there. But talk about the prevalence and the accessibility of the volume of the guns themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's pretty logical. The more guns that are out there, the more times that they will be used in a manner that can kill somebody. Okay. That's again, if there's more than one gun per person in our country. Okay. And again, recognizing that most people use them very responsibly. But nonetheless, the more access that people have, the more that it is in the house, the more likely that a child can get a hold of one. And obviously just the more access, then the more gun shooting there will be. And of course, that includes violent acts. So that's one of the things to take into consideration as well. And again, you will hear we have not in this conversation talked at all about taking guns away from people, right? We have not talked about anything that I've seen politicians who have said, "Oh, by trying to enact any kind of gun regulations, that's just a way of people, another way that they're going to take our guns away. That's just leading down that path." Well, you know what? That is not the case. We have a Second Amendment that is not changing in our country. This is part of who we are as a society. You may agree with it, you don't disagree, but that is what our society and what our Constitution and what our very beginnings were founded on, and I respect that. But at the same time, and again, this is what we're going to lead into with our next and final episode on this topic for this three-part series, is what kind of solutions are there that could reduce the chances of gun violence in our country. So thank you, Shari, for again being part of this conversation and helping really drive the conversation forward in a healthy way.
You're
Again, please
welcome.
check. Yeah, please check out
Well,
our. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you and I had also talked about, and we're not going to go so deep into this in the next episode, but I want to just let our viewers and our listeners know, as a pediatrician, this is obviously a near and dear to David's heart, especially as it relates to youth fatality, youth injury, mental health, fear, all of these kinds of things. And so over these next couple of weeks and months, Dr. David is also going to field some of the questions that are being asked of him from parents, particularly about how to keep their kids safe, about how to when to talk to their kids about guns, if there's guns in the house, how to talk to them in light of shootings that are happening in public places. So, this is certainly a topic that we're exploring right now from a more sociological level and psychological level, but we are going to absolutely also be addressing it as it relates specifically from the perspective of a pediatrician helping parents find their way through this.
Absolutely. All right. Well, again, another call out as you share this with other people, please do. And again, please join us on our social media to get our numbers up, but also so that you know when we are putting out another episode. So I hope everybody has a great day and that we gave you something to think about.